Welcome to the Holy Unapologetic Podcast. I am Ayce, and today we have Anya in the office with us today. So Marq and I will be asking a few questions. And Anya, actually, we have a really fun story because she is the therapist that I called when my life was falling apart. And I remember calling her and being like, hey, there's some things I want to talk about. Definitely want to talk about sex. Are you okay with that? And she was like, hell yeah, let's dive into it. And so the interesting piece is the very first time we met, we had a really great connection and we had multiple meetings and we were kind of strangers, but we had 3 or 4 meetings, probably even more than that. And I remember sitting on her couch one day and I was pouring out my heart and soul and tears were streaming down my face and I had shared my story. And she looks at me dead in the eyes and she goes, honey, you're not straight. And I laughed and I was like, what are you talking about? I like men. And she responded back in a very compassionate way and just said, honey, you are not straight. And that's when I realized, fuck, I'm trans and I'm gay, which is possibly the 2 worst things that can happen to someone who's conservative, Christian, and Republican. And so I'm going to let her share a little bit about her version of the story because it's probably a little bit different than mine, but that's what I remember being a very pivotal moment in my life.
Okay, well, thanks, Ayce, for that introduction. I do remember it slightly differently. I don't remember you cry. I don't think that's what I would have said to someone who's crying. But the way I remember it, like, let me hit you when you're down. The way I remember it is I had certain thoughts as we met, and it took a couple sessions. And the way I remember it is my first thing was suggesting that had you considered that perhaps you were a lesbian? Okay. And that's
I do
when you
remember you
said,
asking that question.
yes, you're like, no, I
Yes.
like men. Okay. And so that's when I didn't want to say you were trans. I just said, well, honey, you're not straight. That's the way I remember it. I don't think I would have laid that on you when you were crying. Maybe it made you cry after at home.
Well, everybody's perception becomes their own reality, right? And that's what
Yes,
happened. That's how I remember
exactly.
it.
Exactly. I
Well,
like to
I'm
think,
glad
I
you
mean,
can.
I do like to get to the point, but I also, like to show compassion as well. So somewhere in between there
Well,
is the truth.
I'm so glad we can let you set the record straight in the
Yeah.
fact that you did a compassionate, empathetic thing for me
Yet
as a patient.
direct,
Yes.
Yeah, you're paying for
Which
sessions.
is.
Make some momentum. Let's move forward you know.
Yeah, do you want for our audiences here just kind of explain what you do and maybe talk a little bit about your role here?
I am a therapist in private practice, and I've really focused on trauma, especially developmental trauma, depression, and anxiety that goes along with that, and whatever people bring. So really, ACE has been the one client I had that I've been through this whole journey with of transitioning and recognizing, understanding transgenderism, and I've been along for the journey. I certainly wasn't an expert in it. I'm still not. And we learn as we go with compassion and heart and non-judgmentally. And that's my goal. And to
Yeah,
be an
that was
ally
the.
and to be an ally.
So that was one of the best parts. Was this was the very first space that I walked into where all of me could exist, and she was capable of holding the space in such a way where she was asking the right questions, she was accepting my responses, and acknowledging the truth that was there. And so I just have a deep gratitude for your expertise, not in transgenderism and that whole piece, because I think I was one of your first clients possibly that went this deep into such a interesting, journey. But you dove right in and held a compassionate, empathetic space for me to process all of the different feelings and emotions that were going on. And I think honestly, that's the reason why I had such a healthy transition is because I had your support on a weekly basis and just diving into whatever was coming up in the moment. If I was having a problem with my, religion or my community, my family, whatever it was, you were able to just really sit there and offer guidance as I was processing what was going on, which was such a huge piece of my journey. So I just want to say a deep, deep thank you and feeling of gratitude for you diving into this space.
Well, and thank you for your honesty and trust for us to go on this journey and for you to grow. And I grow too. Yeah. It's a love fest.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of come back to a question I've asked some of our other guests as well, is how do you kind of work with people at their own pace? I think something that's kind of a frustrating stereotype sometimes with queer people is like, we'll come out to someone and they'll be like, oh yeah, we always knew. So as a therapist, you were kind of talking about this idea of like, I had my suspicions. So obviously you want to be kind of delicate with that, but
right.
You also want to be making progress. But so I'm curious about but you pretty much answered it right away of just having this foundation of compassion. And that's just I'm sure, got to be the basis for everything. But it does seem like a really beautiful thing when you can then be guiding someone through something that not only maybe you don't have as much experience with, but they don't have as much experience with. I don't think there are many people that transition more than once. It's new to us as well. And I know I've certainly found frustrating that some people that are on the transphobic camp will be like, oh, you must just be being manipulated by the woke or these outside forces, when it's such a intimate, personal thing. This idea that somehow someone could just be like, I'm trying to even imagine their scenario where someone's like, you're trans, so now get going. It's just ridiculous. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add on that front of just, working with clients where there are things that you're unfamiliar with. And then maybe there's another side of that spectrum of something that you're very familiar with, but you don't want to rush them and kind of moving at their own pace.
Yeah, that's the hard part. Here's the thing. Talk therapy really doesn't work all that much. It really doesn't. Improvements haven't been made since the 1960s. So last statistics I read is about 30%. Talk therapy helps about 30% of the time. And it's not always necessarily, it's great we have all these tools now. We have cognitive behavioral therapy, things like that, which isn't always great if you have trauma. But what they found really helps is the therapeutic relationship. That's what makes the difference. So it's about finding someone you can trust and to be able to admit, I've never done this before, but I'm here for you and we can go through it together. When I first started, I didn't want to do trauma at all. Just give me some anxiety and depression, give me some people that need tune-ups. But when you get underneath, what is underneath the anxiety and depression is trauma. Always, basically, whether it's shock trauma of assault or what most of us have is attachment or developmental trauma. We've been emotionally hurt. So every situation prompts you to grow. Hopefully, I think why this job is so great for me is it's never the same. Every person brings something new and you're constantly having to learn something new. And you're always growing, you're helping someone grow, and you're doing it together. You're being a supportive person. And that really feels good. And I have made mistakes where I push a little too hard. But then hopefully someone, the goal is if I upset you, if I trigger you, let's talk about it. This is a relationship. How many times we're traumatized because we were hurt by someone and it didn't get resolved. So if we even have in that relationship, it can be resolved. That's something new and we can grow. I can assert myself and say, hey, you hurt me. And it's received. And I get and I'm sorry and forgiveness. Okay. That's really what is different and what we didn't get. So that's what I always help when I first meet people, what I say now, because I do trigger people. If I trigger you, please just tell me. Because I do charge. It's a lot of money. And so I don't think it's fair to say, how does that make you feel? I don't think that's therapeutic. You can talk to a friend and you can share how you feel, but let's what can you do outside of our time together that helps you grow?
Yeah, I found that to be so empowering, is just to start to recognize triggers more quickly. And that's helped my own personal relationship so much better now, to be like, oh, okay, yeah, no, that
Yeah.
there's this thing that used to happen that really bothered me. And that's why so I think that's huge, but everyone is at a different pace with it. And I think it's so fascinating, for your area of work, that it's had such a different cultural perspective in just a generation, where it used to be like, oh, someone's going to therapy. And then
Yeah.
now more people, young people are like, oh, my therapist said something the other day.
Yeah.
It's so cool. It's a massive shift in terms of how we look at the work that you do. And I love that distinction that you were making too, in just terms of describing it as relationship. But I think it can be hard when you're like, I'm so grateful for the work that I've been able to do through therapy, but there are people that don't do that are very uncomfortable by like the therapy talk. And so, whereas I might want to be able to talk about a way a trauma impacted me, some people are like, don't put that on me. Like, don't, it can kind of feel like the trauma dumping thing. Even if that's not a word that they would use, people that aren't kind of in this sphere can get very uncomfortable. Whereas where I'm coming from is like, I want everyone to be able to process all of their trauma so we can all heal and be better and grow and move forward, and not be limited by all of the terrible effects that can still be residual from it. So I don't know if you have any advice for kind of bridging that gap, because it can be really, I think, difficult to meet up with people that are in very different places, of where they're like, oh, I'm staring into the abyss, I'm looking into this, and it's hard, but it's beautiful work. And people that are like, oh, don't bring that stuff up, I don't want to talk about that.
Yeah, let's talk about shoes or clothes or something.
Right.
Yeah, let's keep it
Heavy.
Yes. That's a challenge. Hopefully, I think social media has done a lot to get the word out. I think young people know more than they ever have about trauma issues. It's getting out there. So I think it takes more people knowing, just like with trans issues, the more we know, the less fear there is, hopefully. And it just opens dialogue. So I think at this point, though, so many things, it's about finding our tribe, and is this someone I can have a deeper conversation with or not, and being selective, you know.
So I remember when I came to first see you, I felt broken. I felt bad, wrong, sinful. I felt like the way that I truly wanted to express myself in this world was just not even a possibility. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the thoughts and emotions and feelings that transgender people have? And the fact that I think some people think that this is a mental illness when someone comes out as trans. What are your thoughts from a therapist perspective on diving into this with clients? Is this something that, that is a mental illness?
Oh, it certainly is not. No. That's something we really need to work on. I think the biggest emotions, let's start with emotions first. I think one of the biggest emotions we're dealing with this is shame. Shame is something that keeps us quiet and hidden and afraid to use our voices, afraid to be ourselves out in the world. And underneath that is hurt, anger, all kinds of stuff. And those aren't really socially acceptable emotions. So we just hold them in. I mean, shame is internally corrosive. When we keep it inside, it grows and it just eats us alive, and it gets bigger and bigger. And, Brene Brown has done amazing work. She's a shame researcher. Excuse me. That when we can share it, it cannot live in the light. Empathy is the counterpart to shame. So when we can start, that's where I think having a therapist that is not judgmental, where you can share how you feel and get empathy back, that's where we can start to change in terms of being more comfortable in our own skin. Hopefully, that takes a lot of time given how many years of indoctrination we might have, whether it's religion, culture, all of these things.
Yeah. And I think some of the struggle that I've always had is the perceptions that our society has about this. And I think there's a desire in me to see that shift. And so that society can see us as humans, that we
Right.
belong here, that we can take up
Right.
space, right? Can you
Right.
talk a little bit about that and maybe the shift that society should or could be making, for our listeners even that are out there that don't understand what it's like to be transgender?
Right.
How can they start to change their perception of who we are and our experience in this world?
Couple of things, quite a few things actually. One is, this is around education. What we really need is education, empathy, and a commitment to dismantling systems of exclusion and discrimination. So some areas to focus on is we have to start to understand gender as a spectrum, not this binary thing. Our world really wants to make everything binaries, good or bad, right or wrong, black or white, male or female. I'm always saying life happens in the gray. Human beings, we're not all good or all bad. Every single one of us have good and bad, right? And we have to accept just about everything's on a continuum, right? If we can just accept that, that would be different. Okay. We need to challenge gender norms that boys are blue, girls are pink. When really, it used to be reversed. Do we know this? It
Yeah.
used to be boys wore pink, girls were blue. That's how you identified that. So, I mean, it flip-flops. Come on, let's not stick with boys like trucks, girls like dolls. We have to
Mhm.
stop these gender norms. And I think there are some biological differences. I just think it's interesting that little boys go by a construction site and they love to watch that, and there are maybe some things that are unique to whether how much testosterone or estrogen we have in us, but that doesn't mean it's boy or girl, you know. We have to decouple gender identity from pathology, that your gender identity is not a pathology. It's not bad. It doesn't mean you're born with something that's wrong with you. We have to acknowledge that we all have a right to self-determination, that we are allowed to be ourselves, no matter what. And that is hard for us as human beings because I always say, we are basically still cave people. As cave people, we are wired for conformity. It was hugely important that we fit in because if we got kicked out of the tribe, we would die on our own. And it still feels that way. So we want to conform, but we also have a right to be ourselves, whether it's our values, what we like, don't like, and allow other people that self-determination too. Okay. We have to combat transphobia. That's a huge one. We have to foster intersectional awareness, which is really important. So knowing that trans people of color struggle, that there's intersectionality we're not just one thing. Okay. There's intersectionality. Representation and visibility. I love seeing more shows where there's trans people. If you, Somebody Somewhere, have you guys watched that show
Yeah, it's
on
great.
Max? Oh, such a great show. Or even there was a show with Maya Rudolph where they have a trans person in the show. It's great. Providing comprehensive education is another one. Normalizing pronouns and language. All of these are challenges to current cultural norms. But if you even look how much more gay rights are accepted than when it was early on in the 50s and 60s, we are making progress. Trans issues are just the newest thing that's on people's radars. And oh, what's that? What's a they? And it's just going to take time. But the more we use these pronouns and challenge them, the more they just get in the lexicon. And prioritizing allyship is another one I would add. That even though we're not trans, we're helping those who are. So that's quite a lot there.
It's a great list.
So the interesting thing with allyship, in my opinion, is some people will say that they're an ally, and it kind of feels like they're just saying it. And I kind of feel like allyship needs to come at a cost for someone in order for them to actually say that they're an ally. like, is there some sort of cost to you helping me or standing alongside of me or protecting me? What does that look like? And I think that's a really interesting piece that's starting to really develop in our country, of people really standing alongside of us and saying, this is not just an issue that's out there that doesn't impact me, or has zero effect on my life, but this is something that actually impacts me because it impacts you, and I'm going to stand alongside of you and take that cost and help you move through this and be your advocate, which I think is a huge piece in actually having real allyship in the United States and internationally as well.
Yeah, I really like that point. I mean, I don't want it to have to be that negative of it being a cost, but really, I mean, I remember when some of my dearest people in my life were using they them pronouns. That was kind of when I first got to practice getting my tongue around it, and it was easy enough to explain to people of like, oh, well, they matter to me, and this is what the language they want me to use, so I'm going to try to use it. And you make mistakes and you try to do better. But I think where that stood out the most was when I was then talking to like potentially transphobic family members and that knew these people. It's like, I might use the right language, but am I going to correct them if they don't? And probably not going to, make a whole thing of it. And they're not in the room, but that would have been a cost for me to then start up that conversation. And I wish I were bolder. And I don't remember exactly how many occasions it may or may not have come up in. I'd like to believe that now I'd be perfect. It would always be like, actually, they use these pronouns. But, it's easy for me to think about now. Like, I doubt that the people that aren't supportive of my life are then referring to me by my chosen name and pronouns when I'm not in the room either. So that's just what came to my mind when you talk about that cost. There are a lot of ways. There's easier allyship, and then there's less easy allyship, certainly.
Right. I think it can still be a risk of just standing up for that person, saying, no, they use these pronouns. That can still be a risk for someone in that relationship with the person they're talking to. What would you like to see, Ayce?
Kumbaya. Let's all just get along.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, I think, a part of this journey that I dove into really hardcore with you, Anya, was that radical self-love and loving myself first. And then whatever happens from the outside world, if it's, friends not accepting me, family not accepting me, like, can I come to the table and love myself in those spaces and be able to stand up for myself? And at times I do a great job, and I'm able to, go toe to toe with someone out of love for myself and understanding that this is what I need to do for myself. And at other times I failed miserably, and it's just been a really good learning ground for me. So I've appreciated your expertise in that. And I don't know if you have anything that you'd like to add to that from a therapist point of view.
Yeah, I really do think it comes down to our own self-worth. If we have really strong self-worth, which we're all working on, then we don't care so much what other people say about us. We can stand in our own truth and go, it doesn't matter if you don't like my pronouns or you don't believe in me. I believe in me. And that gives us the strength, one, to not get so triggered by other people, to not take it personally, and to march on and to be ourselves in the world. I deserve to be here. I have just as much worth as you do. And I'm not going to personalize your values. I deserve to be here. That's all of our journeys. And the problem is we live in multiple cultures that constantly tell us that we are not good enough yet, and that there are very specific rules. There are golden yardsticks out there by which you will never measure up. And that's what happens here in the States, living a capitalist consumerist culture that is constantly telling you, they're selling pimple cream, that you're not good enough, or diets, or whatever. Our whole culture is based on insecurity, and it's making some very specific people extremely rich. Let's not buy into it. Oh, I was also going to say, Ed, whatever we're talking about capitalism, we can also substitute religion in there.
Yes, we can. I was just going to say, so living here in Southern California, we have a lot of beautiful marinas by the water. And I had this thought the other day, was with that, it would be so amazing if I had a boat. What an economic echelon I would be in if I had a boat. And I thought if I pulled my boat into that marina, I would be sitting next to the other 1,000 people that are better than me because their boat is bigger. Like, no matter where you're at in life, if I could be living in Southern California with a boat, then I would just be then right up next to all the other people in Southern California that can afford boats that are probably big. And it's like you can always find ways to be miserable by that comparison. Comparison is the thief of joy. It's a quote that I think about a lot. So,
Exactly.
it's so money made off of making us feel we're not thin enough, we're not pretty enough, that kind of thing. It's constant. But I love what you said about personalizing someone else's values. That can be really hard, especially if you're raised with the religious upbringing of black and white and like moral and amoral, because there are so many different things that are the people that are able to say like, oh, I don't get into politics. It's like, this is life and this is everyone's life. But from their perspective, they can just fall back on largely like, oh, this is a moral issue, whatever it is. If you can mask it that way, then you can just be like, oh, I have the perfectly right answer and everyone else is a bad person. And of course, we know there's so much more in the gray. But I think I also liked what you were saying, Ayce, about some days I'm ready to just go toe to toe. And I think that's something I didn't necessarily expect as much of with my transition, is like, oh, I'm suddenly an activist now. Like I am now in this position of representation and I now have to be explaining all of transgender history to everyone. Like people in my family that I thought wouldn't have been as supportive were actually some of the ones that were asking me a bunch of questions. And that's great. That's a good sign. But that doesn't mean I'm always going to be in a place where I'm ready to have my entire identity kind of picked apart. Well, like, but what does that mean? And are you going to get surgeries? And like, does that mean you don't want to do this? Or what if your voice changes? Like, and that's like better than the ones that are just like, this is made up and you're being manipulated by the left, So I wonder, from Anya, from your perspective, and we can kind of segue some of this into boundaries too, that idea of knowing when to kind of stand up for yourself and advocate as we're in this kind of minority situation, but also when to be like, this is starting to feel a little icky, or I don't really know if I have the emotional energy right now to it's not my job to educate everyone on everything related to the history of gender non-conforming people. So so I guess my question is to Anya, and I would imagine it kind of comes back to listening to yourself, but when to kind of fight the good fight and when to say, this isn't my job and I'm going to go and have some quiet time.
Yeah, boy, I might be the wrong person to ask this because and not that I necessarily believe in astrology, but I'm an Aries, so I just kind of ram. I'm a fire sign, and maybe it's too from being oppressed as a child and being raised in a household that said children should be seen and not heard and religious. I'm like, F you, man. Like I have had a whole lifetime of being made to be quiet and as a female. So, and I also say to my clients, because women are raised to be pleasing, don't upset people. And I always say to my clients, why is it everyone else out there gets to spout their opinions, but you don't? I really have a hard time with that. So, why is it you can say, well, you're what you're doing is a sin? Well, that's your opinion. Why can I not say I don't agree? You're wrong. Come on. Let's use our voices. We might get tired of it. It's up to you to decide how much of a spokesperson you want to be or an educator. I don't know. My role is I feel like I'm always teaching, whether people want me to teach or not. So a woman bumps into me at the grocery store. Women say sorry way too much. I'm constantly saying, I'll just say, don't say sorry, and hopefully they'll think about that. Or I'll say, why are you sorry? It can be just a little nugget, but I don't know. I don't do well with I think I had to acquiesce so often that I really advocate for people speaking up. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be big. It doesn't, I'm sorry, you don't have to stand on a soapbox and lecture them. But even just saying, I don't agree, we'll have to agree to disagree, something like that. When we're quiet, that also shows we're telling someone that we agree. Silence is acquiescence and agreement.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't have to be aggressive in it, but I'm allowed to have my opinion as well. Okay. And don't use your morality as some banner that now that shuts down the entire conversation. Because that's what that's used for.
Absolutely.
You can't go above morality, so shut you down.
And that's been a huge piece of my journey, is that self-abandonment piece. I have been quiet and reserved and shut down almost my entire life up until the time when I came out, because I couldn't express who I was, and I wasn't able to take up space. And what you're saying is, fuck that. Take up the space. Let your opinions, let your thoughts, let your feelings, let your emotions be heard. And I think that's part of the reason why I struggled so much in the last couple of years with, physical health issues, because I was repressing all of that, and I was unable to just stand up and say, hey, can you see me? Can you hear me? Can you acknowledge me? Can you accept me? Like,
Right.
our body is holding on to all of this pain and repression and anger and sadness. And at some point, that's going to come out sideways, either in an injury or in a sickness or something like that. The body holds on to these stories that we have. And what you're saying is, be willing to interject your opinions and your feelings and your emotions so that other people can understand where you're coming from and give you a space to actually express who you are.
100%. 100%. Yes, and it is true. The body holds the wisdom. The body cannot lie. This lies all the time. Let's listen to the body. Oh, what's that going on in me? Instead of what this is. Oh, be quiet. Don't make waves. Okay. Yeah, for sure. I've been told so many times, even if there's a disagreement and someone says, oh, well, just let it go. We don't say our opinion. Well, here's the thing. Here's what I tell people too. It's easier just to be quiet. Always is. But if we're quiet, then the story becomes the other person's belief about us. So if nothing else, at least stand up for yourself and say, no, this is why I did this. This is what I believe, so that I'm controlling my own narrative. I'm not being quiet so you can fill in, oh, well, they're mentally ill. That's why they did it, because I didn't speak up for myself. If nothing else, put your truth out there so that it can't be watered down or changed. How that person decides to take what you say is out of your hands, but at least you have spoken your truth.
Yeah, I think there's so much pressure for people assigned female at birth and raised that way to just take up less space in every way, physically, socially, all of these things. I did want to share one kind of funny example of this. The comedian Sarah Cooper got really viral during the pandemic because she was lip syncing to Donald Trump's speeches and interviews and things like that. She's a woman of color, and she made this great point in an interview that's always stuck with me, where she said that, like, you can kind of see him talking for an hour and you just kind of expect that from this older white man. But when you see a woman of color talking and saying these things, you're like, wow, he's really not saying anything. Like, there's like nothing he's actually communicating. Like, you expect this enormous caliber of articulation, and because, people that are in these marginalized groups have to be infinitely better at everything that they do, which isn't fair. But I thought that was so interesting. The idea of, like, the fact that he can just kind of ramble is something that we allow for, the straight white man or whatever, but you see it coming from this woman of color and suddenly it's like, oh wow, he's not saying. So anyway, the idea of actually speak your piece, but I that always stuck with me. But so important to take up space. And I talked about this in an earlier podcast, but I knew that I was going on this journey of self-discovery and self-actualization, being more and more myself. But then I would sit down to talk with family and I would feel like, okay, let me just kind of pull the curtain over all the queer stuff and the trans stuff and, this, like, I'm a writer. I was starting to write this sapphic love story that I'm very proud of, but it was like, let's just put that away. And it just, as much as I could do both, I knew I was lying to myself. Essentially, I would spend half of my day saying I love myself, I love my new life, I love that I'm living more authentically, and then it'd be like, okay, now take all those things and put those in a box, and we'll take it. And it just kind of felt like, as much as my brain could keep up the ruse, my body was being like, well, do you like me or do you not like me?
Yes.
And so then I increasingly was like, I don't want to maintain relationships in that way. Keep going. I can't do that anymore. I can't just keep being a fake person. But I think what it was is to be convenient, to be the shape that they would have wanted me to be. And, for women to always feel like they have to be contorting to make sure everyone else is comfortable, even down to the idea of like man spreading, like men are just used to sitting comfortably versus like women, doing everything we can to move out. I just saw a post that was saying how like, oh, my sister's doing this new thing where if she's walking and there's a man, she won't move out of the way because they just always expect them to move out of the way. And she's like, she's bumped into 28 men so far and she's loving it. Like it's these subconscious things of taking up less space. So I think that was a big one for me to that idea of I can't kind of live these two lives. But I guess then we can segue to something we were going to talk about is this idea of boundaries. It can be especially heartbreaking with family because there's always this expectation that no, everything should be perfect. It's your blood, that kind of a thing. But I wonder what your thoughts are on that topic, because I think it is increasingly a thing where people are having more disconnect to their parents. We've been through some pretty tumultuous years of people being divided. But then I also wonder how that ties in with what you were talking about of moving people at their own pace. Like I wonder if sometimes, and of course you can't speak to your other clients, but the idea of being like, oh, they really need to cut this person off, but they haven't yet. And I get why, but damn. What are your thoughts when it comes to like relationships, especially with difficult ones where there's this expectation of like, but it's your mom,
Right. There's a lot of cultural expectation of honor thy mother and father, right? At all costs. And there's the self-abandonment right there of that when we abandon ourselves and we have low self-worth, what we're basically saying is they have more worth than I do. Their needs have more value than mine. Their comfort is more important than mine. And it is my job to smooth things over so that they're okay. And that's that self-abandonment. But what about us? Again, what about our voice? What about our comfort? What about our bodies? And yeah, I always have thoughts and opinions, but it's easier said than done. And I do with people, I tell them what I think, but that doesn't mean that someone's going to easily be able to do that. Stand up for yourself. Yeah, you deserve. I'm like a cheerleader sometimes. You're awesome, all this stuff. But that is really hard for all of us to translate in real life, to actually believe that. So I think every person has their own family situation, and first it's thinking about what's best for me. Let's put me in the equation, not just about how do I not upset mom or dad or anyone. That's where we get the discomfort in the body, where we are just neglecting ourselves. Because again, their feelings have more validity than mine. So we have to clarify our needs. If we were to actually clarify, what is it I need from this relationship? What is best for me? Just at least put yourself in the equation with them. Well, mom or dad need to not feel uncomfortable. Great. What do I need? I need to feel okay in my own skin. I need to feel that I am loved as I am. Just identify that for yourself, whatever all the needs might be. Yeah. And it gets very particular with each family. How safe do we feel? How will we be supported when we go against the family norm? But ideally, it's communicate our needs assertively. It's not, I think we all struggle with assertiveness, and that's a continuum also. We have passiveness on this side, aggressiveness on the other. Females are raised to be passive. Men are raised to be aggressive. We all need to be assertive. That's in the middle. We don't have to bark or growl to get our needs met, but that means we can say no and say what we need with just, assertive language. no, thank you, but this is what I prefer, things like that. So learning to communicate assertively is hugely important. Don't apologize for being who we are, for setting boundaries. Okay, this is easier said than done, but that's what we have to deal with. And then we have to prepare for pushback on that, okay, from family members who don't agree. Okay, and how do we do that? Validate and empathize with their position, but also say, but there's also a but. It's a yeah, but yeah, I get it. This is scary. You don't understand it, but here's reality. Okay. We might have to then limit seeing those people or talking about certain topics. But really it's I always there's okay, let me interject here. I say toxic is toxic. If someone is toxic to you, it doesn't matter if it's a family member. That's the way I see it. If it is not healthy for you, if you get really anxious, you're not supported, you're shamed, that's not a good relationship. So there's a lot of growth that has to come there of valuing ourselves enough to say, maybe this relationship doesn't serve me. And that's a hard decision everyone has to make on their own of, should I keep this relationship or not? And that's a really, really hard decision. It's really hard.
Of self-abandonment. I mean, I feel like this is a phrase Ayce and I say every episode is deny thyself, but they're really, that was such an early thing instilled in me as well. And you were mentioning this, Anya, of like, basically that children should be seen and not heard. For me, it was just that the adult's word matters and everything we build is so much more important. Even breaking other rules, that was the hierarchy. And I think that was part of why I had such a strong academic drive from a young age, is like, it's not really enough if I'm good, but if I have an adult saying that I'm good, then I'm good.
That's it.
But that self-abandonment piece and making everyone else comfortable is such a huge thing. Like I remember there's this story that's really stuck with me of being a young woman, and I was at this like church party kind of thing. We were at someone's house, and I was just like giving my mom a little massage on her shoulders, and this much older man was like, "Oh, you're gonna do me next? You're gonna do my shoulders next?" And I was like, "Ha ha ha." He said it again. And I was like, no, just, and it got to the point where like no one else stood up for it. And he kept saying it, that I did have to give this older man a massage, this really creepy situation. My mom's right there too, so I don't need to like, critique her, but it's like, I wish I was protected from that situation where I was clearly uncomfortable, clearly said no, but it was just like, there's an adult. Someone wants to be made comfortable, whether it's silly or fun for them or whatever it is. I was physically put in an uncomfortable position. And I just feel like that memory is just such a perfect example of the ways that we were expected. And especially for me, I come back to being a pastor's kid. Like we were always having to perform, always having to be on wherever we needed to be to make everyone else comfortable. And so I think it's all the harder for someone with that kind of an upbringing to be like, oh, I'm uncomfortable and I should actually like do something about it, let alone with someone that I love very much, like a family member. But like, this is a toxic relationship. This isn't a healthy relationship. I think it's really hard when you're so used to not listening to yourself, not listening to your body, or listening and then having to neglect it anyway, because, well, this is what I have to do in this situation, that kind of a thing.
Yeah. Well, and the hard part is, probably your mom didn't, that's where your mom was raised.
Yeah.
She didn't know any different. I could share a personal story of where I did that to my daughters at a wedding, but luckily my daughter said something. She brought up something I never even really realized, as women were raised, well, just don't make a scene. So just do what the man wants, so that, because he'll shame you, like, oh, you're no fun, that kind of stuff. So I would say a lot of women don't even realize that you can stand up for yourself, because you will be victim blamed. It's going to be turned on you. So sometimes it's easier just to do that, just so it stops.
Yeah. I saw this recently, and it was a post about how there are young girls in a sex ed class that had written in the most common question was like, how do you prevent pregnancy? And the most common question was, how do I say no without him getting angry or getting upset?
Right.
And it's just so hard. Like, I so wish of course, my sex ed was just don't ever have sex and don't think about it. But the idea, I wish it could have been, even for less than sex, to just be able to say no when you're not feeling comfortable. But being raised female, that's just like not even on the table.
Right.
And that's
Exactly.
really, really heartbreaking to think about, to just that how many young women would just have said no. And I've also been in situations, non-consensual, been assaulted before. It's very much, I would have, did not have consent or did not give consent in those situations. But yeah, that just kind of breaks my heart when you're raised that way, that all these young girls could just be like, how do I just not make him mad when I don't want to do this thing? It's like outside of sometimes the realm of possibility.
Right.
With that.
And you think that every child in that kind of thing, you have no power. Your whole job as a kid is to really, it's about attachment. I need my parents to love me enough to care for me so I don't die. I can't go out and go, peace out, family. I'm going to go find a family that loves me better. You have to conform. And then we're indoctrinated in this, be passive, just be pleasing. And then we become adults and we're just supposed to flip that switch off and stand up for ourselves. I mean, it's a piece of who we are, and that takes a lot of work. So if we go back to boundaries, using I statements is another way of, instead of you make me feel like I don't matter, use this is how I feel. At least say how you feel. I feel when I come here that you don't see me, you don't respect me. I'm not respected. Okay, start using I statements. Okay, so that people can hear, and you're talking about you, not about someone else. Okay, practice saying no. I tell people, especially people who are raised female in this culture, I tell them when you're driving in the car, just practice saying no out loud, just so you're used to it coming out of your mouth. Or if you need to set a boundary with someone, or just practice saying, I disagree. Just say that out loud. So it needs to be procedural and habitual. So just practice saying that. Okay. Another thing is enforce consequences. So ideally, if we think about, I love this. Here's how I want you to think about it. When we set boundaries, let me find my little notes here. Here's kind of a boundary script. So we want to acknowledge, set the boundary, and then identify the consequences. Okay. So acknowledgement. Here's an example. I understand that this might be new for you. Let's acknowledge this is challenging, perhaps. Then we set the boundary. However, I need you to respect my name and pronouns. Okay. Then the consequences. If that's not possible, I'll need to limit our conversations until you're ready to do so. Okay. And I always say this is a parenting technique too. This is not new. You tell the child, okay, we're going to the grocery store. If you don't ask me for anything, you can get a treat after. If you ask me for something, we're going to, whatever. If you act up, we're going to leave the store. You give the person the opportunity to succeed or fail. The consequence is up to you. Okay. So that's a nice way to set a boundary. But I think ultimately we have to decide, is this relationship worth my effort? Will it be fruitful? Or is it just always going to be at an impasse? And am I barking up the wrong tree? I often have to tell people, you might be trying to get something from a parent that they cannot give you, like love. It doesn't mean they don't love you. They maybe can't express it because they were denied that. They just don't get it. You don't keep dipping into an empty well.
Yeah, that was a major growth edge for me personally, was understanding that not everybody has the capacity to meet me where they need to meet me. And to take ownership in what I can do. This is what I can do. These are the boundaries, these are the constraints that I can set up to protect myself or to speak up for myself. But I don't have ownership of somebody else's experience, and maybe they don't have the ability to come into this space right now in a way that needs to be, in a way that they can meet my needs or I can meet their needs. And so making sure that I have ownership of myself and acknowledging that they have ownership of their own experience. And we might not be connecting right now. And there's just not a capacity for them to engage in that. To do that. Mm-hmm. Another piece that's been really huge for me is realizing that no is a complete sentence. I don't have to explain myself. So if I'm interacting with someone and something happens and I don't have the capacity to explain why I feel the way I do, I can literally say no and then get myself out of that situation if possible. And in that moment, I've stood up for myself. I've taken ownership for my own experience, and I can come back to it in 24 hours, 7 days, whatever it may be, and come to that person and say, hey, this is really what was going on. I just didn't have the capacity at the moment because I had so much charge going through my nervous system. I couldn't meet you in that space. But let's have a conversation now and unpack exactly what happened and what harm was there. A lot of times I think about what is the intent of a person and what is the impact in the situation, right? They may not have intended to hurt me, but they did. And so how do I go into that conversation later on when I don't have charge and explain, hey, this is how it made me feel. This is the reason why I had to put up this boundary. This is the reason why I had to say no. Sometimes you don't need to explain yourself, but if it's a relationship that's really meaningful to you, set aside time later on when both of you are well nourished and replenished and ready to have a conversation and able to engage in healthy dialogue with each other about what really did happen. How do we repair the rupture that's happened here?
Mm-hmm. And easier said than done with someone who understands that language and knows what it means to repair, as opposed to you just have to acquiesce. But that is the ultimate goal. If we could just get, from the rupture to repair, then we're attuned again.
Yeah. It is not always possible. And maybe you don't always want to do it, and that's okay. That's where you can take ownership and have agency and power in saying, this is not right for me. I do not want to engage in this conversation or this relationship at this point in time, and put up that boundary.
Right. You might not want to, and they might not be capable of it where they are.
Exactly.
In terms of their self-actualization. You're speaking Greek. It's not connecting.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think, I hate to say older generations, I think don't have this language. Unfortunately, it's just you do what you're told, and this is the way it is. You're supposed to obey me. Respect your elders.
Yeah, I think it ties to the idea of just wanting to be whole on our own instead of finding people to complete us in various ways. So I wonder if the relationships that are most ruptured are the ones where it's like, no, I was leaning on you when you were this type of a stool, and now you're changing shape. And that's, we want to be whole on our own. And I think those are the most beautiful relationships where you want to be together and love each other and help each other grow. But it's not like we're so it's really not like a yin and a yang, like, oh, I don't have this, but you do. So, be much more flexible.
It's not you complete me kind of thing.
Exactly. And it makes it easier to sever when things are toxic. And then hopefully that does change. And it's, but that's something I have to kind of remind myself of, because I think for people that are upset that I'm transitioning, they kind of treat it like I'm causing a big fuss and I'm causing all these problems. I'm ruining the family. But it's like, I'm not asking anything of anybody. I'm just existing. And that helps kind of remind me, like, I'm not telling them to behave a certain way. They're not paying my bills. They're not, like, I'm just living my own life. And I think that's probably the most frustrating, I think, to some people that are expecting you to be a certain shape or to fill a certain, check certain box for them in their own list. And I try to be, a big value of mine is just total self-ownership. And then from there, hopefully you have a stronger foundation to be able to pick and choose and maintain friendships like your own garden and water them and go from there. But, to try to be on your own instead of you complete me.
Yeah. And I
do what's right for you.
Right. And that's another part of setting boundaries is having your own support system. So if it's, creating chosen family, joining communities where you are supported is hugely important. And I wanted to speak on something you said, Marq. If we can go back and realize, I am triggering something, oh my gosh, me changing is causing people distress. If we realize what they're really struggling with is their own feelings and them just being challenged. It's don't make me feel uncomfortable. So please go back to the way you were because these are feelings I don't know how to handle. That's all it is. No, you learn how to deal with your feelings. Go to therapy, figure out your feelings so that we can all just be ourselves. Don't acquiesce because someone hasn't done their work and is uncomfortable in their feelings.
Wait long enough. I'm still living my life.
Yeah, exactly. Don't bend just because other people. It's only very recently we realized how important emotions are. Before like 2011, let's say, everything was raising kids was emotions are a problem, shut them down. Emotions get in the way of rationality. And your job as a parent is just to get your children to comply and not embarrass you. So there was no emotional attunement. That's the way our parents were raised. I was raised that way. So the emotional immaturity is rampant. And that's what we're dealing with. If you just really think about it, it's not I'm bad and I'm causing problems. They don't know how to handle their emotions. Oh, and if you're interested, there is a great series of books. A woman, I could try to find it on my shelf. A woman has written a book called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, which is really helpful of understanding. She identifies 4 types of emotionally immature parents. So she wrote this book, and then people said, well, great, this is great information, but how do I deal with it? Then she came out with how to handle your emotionally immature parents. So that's helpful information in terms of not making it about ourselves. All of us are allowed to be us. Why can't they accept me as I am? Because you're making me feel bad. And that's up to them. If they think, what did I do wrong? Well, that's your interpretation. You're going to feel bad if you think I am trans because you did something wrong in your parenting. That's on you. That's on you. Go work on that. Okay. I'm okay as I am. I'm allowed to be here as I am.
Beautiful. One thing to tie it back around with the idea of representation too, it's like when people think that trans people, it's just some trend, it's just some recent thing. It's like, we were just kids like anyone else. I just was a kid that was told I couldn't dress certain ways or couldn't play with the same group that I wanted to, or couldn't play the sports that I wanted to, or when I wanted to be a male character for Halloween, it had to have some spin to make sure it was really actually female, and that like shame and embarrassment. And it's just like, I just want people to know that we were just, and I saw the great post about, I think you shared it, Ayce, about just all these other statistics of people. Like if you've met any of these people, you've also met a trans person. Like we're out here. It's not just always you don't always know. And but yeah, there's in talks of representation in the documentary Disclosure, which is amazing. They gave the example about how this one woman came out as trans to their friend, and they're like, oh, like Silence of the Lambs, like this serial killer who basically was, this terrible situation in that movie. But that was the first thing they were able to grab in terms of representation that came to mind versus like, oh, wow, I love this show and there's a trans character in that. It's this terrible, terrible situation. How awful would that feel? But it was this well-meaning person, and that was just the first thing that came to their mind in terms of someone. It's like you don't even want to call it like a trans situation at all, but it just shows how crucial and how barren the wasteland is for trans representation. So it's like it's quality, but also quantity. And I think of when it comes to, we're getting more and more queer love stories and representation, but it's still, the joke is that like, they're not going to both end up alive. They're not going to end up with a happy ending. So even then there's this idea of like, yeah, gay people exist, but it's too bad. It doesn't really work out. Here's this traumatic love story. And so that's where I started writing. Like, I'm going to write a happy love story where, it's not this tragedy, but we absolutely need more of that representation. But also just kind of wish there were more people that could understand just we're normal kids too, And as Ayce and I both talked about, these are things that when you really do look back, it's like, okay, I knew when I was 4 or 5, 6. For many people, that's the case. It's just so much of that conditioning that we try to change our shape to fit what everyone else wants of us. And it takes a really long time to then love authentically. But then when we start to, it's like, oh, I wouldn't trade this for anything. And if people don't want that for me, then and they probably don't really love me for me. And I got to just keep on trying to live authentically, because that's the way we can kind of show up best in the world and take best care of ourselves.
Right. And I think the hope is with change, that will also help that other person grow ever so incrementally. We only change very slowly as people. It's just like why New Year's resolutions don't work is because people try to make these big changes. You need to make little baby steps. But if I always say we can shape people's behavior when we change, all relationships I call a game, right? We set up these unspoken rules of this game. I'm going to please you all the time and make sure you're okay. When we change that, well, all of a sudden we've changed the rules of the game and the other person doesn't know how to play now. But when we stick to our guns and say, this is who I'm changing, how I'm playing this game, then hopefully that person will slowly start to come along. If not, then that's when this just isn't going to work. If they're unwilling to change, that's when we have to really look at, is this not going to work at all? If you see and also recognizing, are you recognizing even small changes in someone? It is not going to be overnight. None of us change overnight. Okay. Even with self-acceptance, it would be great if we could just say, I feel I'm worthy. We can say that. It doesn't mean we'll embody it for a very long time. And then it just takes one, oh, I made a mistake. Oh, there goes my self-worth, right? We're all working on it. But it's how long do we hang in there with people and yeah, just keep doing the work for ourselves. It's ongoing. All of it.
So I feel like this is a great segue into medically transitioning and the process in which we change, right? And so you're mentioning right now that it's a slow process for someone to change and to come to these realizations. When I was getting ready to medically transition, I had been thinking about this for some time. And I remember when I announced this to my friends, I was like, yeah, I'm transgender, I'm gay. And they're like, okay, cool. You know, like they were working through it with me. It wasn't like the end of the world. And then I started saying, I think I'm going to start to medically transition. And they were like, oh, this is so fast. This is abrupt. Like, these are major changes. Are you ready to do this? And for me, in my journey, it was a really slow process of realizing throughout my life, this is who I am, and this is how I can authentically express myself. Can you speak about it from a therapist perspective? What is it like for somebody to medically transition? This isn't something that, somebody decides, oh, I'm going to do this. And they go into school and they get a transition. They come out and they're like, oh, I was Sally and now I'm Johnny. That's not how this works. Like,
right.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's been a huge piece of contention in our society right now, of people thinking that we make these decisions on a whim and it's really easy to do. But the process really has checks and balances in it. And from a therapist perspective, could you share a little bit about what that looks like?
Yeah, it's changing a little bit. I think we have to realize that there's a misconception that we have to realize that therapy for transitioning is not about, my job is not to prove someone's transgender identity, but it's about supporting that person and their well-being. I think people think, oh yeah, it's almost like, we'll get a diagnosis, for this mental illness you have, it's different state by state because you're dealing with, if we're, medical situations. Some states do require a diagnosis of gender dysphoria for treatment. So that's why that diagnosis is in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. It's so that it can be reimbursed with insurance. Silly. Don't get me started. So, and it is not a mental illness. Okay. It was taken out. There was gender incongruence that was taken out of the ICD in 2018 by the World Health Organization. Okay. So it is not a mental illness. So my role is not to determine whether someone has a condition. Okay. It's about supporting um, that process in the best way for that person. And it's starting to move, like you needed a letter, just like people who get bariatric surgery need counseling because it's also a big change after. But they're starting to change. So surgery has been, you need a letter that you're mentally healthy, kind of, to go through this procedure from a therapist. But it's starting, luckily, it's moving to an informed consent model instead of we need the authority of a therapist or a psychologist saying you are okay to undergo this procedure or hormone treatment or whatever. Informed consent is more informing you, here's the risks, the benefits, all of this, and you make your own informed choice, which I think is a much better way to go. So I think when we involve therapists, it's about identifying something that's wrong. So let's understand that piece. And also, therapy is not actually necessary in order to transition. It's optional, but it's very beneficial. It's really about helping you with all the stages that happen. And I don't feel like I'm really the person to speak about this. Ayce, you're the one who's been through it. Well, both of you, So I really can't speak on what it's like to transition.
Yeah.
Just my part of whatever someone brings to me in the moment, we're going to work on. And we still don't forget all the things in the past we've talked about and making it a cohesive narrative. And how do we keep moving forward? Because each day can bring something different. But I don't really think that I can really speak on it as well as you can. We do have to look at, but when you transition, does it bring up more depression, more anxiety? It brings up trauma. Just like bariatric surgery, they said part of the problem why they need therapy is someone loses a lot of weight, yet they still see themselves as fat and not living in that reality. So they have dysmorphia. They might have dysmorphia where here we have dysphoria. And that's something to work through too.
Yeah.
So it's about creating a support system.
So in my perspective, it felt like there was a lot of red tape that I needed to jump through. Like in order to go get on T, I had to talk with a therapist, and then I had to talk to a doctor, and then I had to find someone who would prescribe T. And that was a process. It wasn't just like, oh, I want to get on T and I have it. I have the prescription. It's like, no, you're going to go through these processes and you're going to make sure that this is a decision that you want to make for your life. And then eventually we'll get you there. It was the same with top surgery. I felt like there was some red tape that I had to jump through for insurance purposes and all of that, to get the letter saying that I'm mentally stable enough to have this procedure done as an adult, that I feel like, a cis het person could go and they could go get a breast reduction or something without having a letter. And I needed to have this letter to prove that I was okay enough to go and have this procedure. So I do think it is shifting, but it was also really hard. But the best part about this for me was when I hired you as a therapist, I had someone else to bounce these ideas to. And it wasn't just me thinking about, oh, I want to do this, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm sad, I'm whatever. You helped me process it and then decide which procedures were best for me in the moment. I remember, and we're still talking about this to this day about bottom surgery. And if I want to have that procedure or if I don't, what are the risks? What are the actual, positives and pros that I'll get from this? And what are some of the negative effects that it's going to have on my life? And to have somebody where I can have very open conversation about, man, these are the desires that I have. This is the dysphoria that hits me on a day-to-day basis and it's taking me out. And to have someone help me process, is this the best decision for me in this moment, was the catalyst to me being able to make the right decisions in what I needed to do for my body.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I just definitely want to reiterate that cis people get gender affirming care all the time. Surgeries, I was just double checking my fact here, but like Joe Rogan takes testosterone. Like this is not, but we have to go through all these different steps. And I'm grateful, in California, I know it's infinitely harder, I would imagine, in other states, but there still are a lot of steps, and it's not this straight line. But I'm really grateful to my life coach. He's also transgender male, and he wanted to be really kind of clear early on that it's going to be really exciting to get on T, but a lot of times once you get on T, all you think is like, I'll be happy when I get top surgery. Then you get top surgery. Okay, I'll be happy when I get bottom surgery. And then trans people can kind of stay miserable, just focused on the next thing. And this is an extended process, especially with different types of bottom surgery. It can be over the course of many years. So we really talked a lot about wanting to make sure we're good on our own and we're whole, to tie that back around, and that even if no one else acknowledged my gender identity, if I'm good with myself, even if I never got to be on hormones, ever got to get surgery, I'm good with myself. It's a strong foundation. And then from there, it's just can be a really exciting, beautiful journey to have things that are more, to experience all the euphoria and the validation, and in some cases to get to exist in the world if you are passing, which, means more to some people than others. But yeah, it's quite a journey, but it is a lot of red tape, like you were saying.
Well, and Marq, I love that you brought up, okay, I'll be happy when I get on hormones. I'll be happy when I get top surgery. I just think that's a human condition, period. It's just, what's that thing we're focusing on? And I see that all coming down to simplify it, try to make it easy, is that we don't do well living in the moment, of
Yes.
So it's like, what's this next the dangling carrot, the brass ring? I won't have to work, so I won't have to ever feel bad and setting up these beliefs that if I just had this, I could be happy. Well, part of really being happy is experiencing the discomfort, any uncomfortable emotions too. That's what makes us happier. It's about being in the moment and being mindful and knowing that, well, I'm not happy in this moment, but that's not going to last forever. What we want, I always say, the future oriented stuff is an escape hatch. Okay. Oh, I don't feel good right now. Well, let me project into, I call it Disney thinking. Anytime, if we ever use the word I just wish I had this, fill in the blank. We all have our own, right? Then I could be happy. That's Disney thinking. It's this magical land where we imagine the perfect scenario out there, and it takes us out of the present moment. So now I don't feel bad anymore because now I'm picturing, oh, wouldn't that be so great to have top surgery or bottom surgery or whatever it is. But it doesn't work because we feel good for a moment, but at some point we have to come back to reality and go, oh yeah, but I don't have that. So let's learn how to just be with and accept, but I don't have that. But here's my value, here's my worth, I deserve to be here, whatever it is, and balance it out. Be with the discomfort. We don't always have to just change it. Validate but. I like but. Yeah, this sucks. I don't like this, but I have this. Let's validate and empathize our own emotions, validate our situation. But then let's get in reality. Okay. It's good and bad. It's gray. Okay. Let's learn to live in that. That is life. And then we won't have to do the escape hatch.
And I think there are things you can learn about the escape hatch too. Like for me, I always had this fantasy that I would have this mansion up on the Hollywood Hills overlooking the city. I'd have one of those nice infinity pools. And there's like a day where I was like, okay, let's think about this a little further. And what I realized I was loving about that image was that in this moment, in this fantasy, I could rest. I didn't have anywhere I had to be. I had enough money to not worry. I could just exist. And it was like, that was more the fantasy than where I happened to be. And so I was like, okay, so I need to work on right here, right now, learning how to find rest, because that's exactly kind of probably the biggest thing I struggle with, is always thinking about the next thing to get done, the next thing to get done. And I get such a high off of being productive. Like where some people might put something off, I'm like, oh, I can do that, with this idea that then I can rest, but I can always think of more things to do. And so that's my own way of not being in the present moment. And so I would love any advice you have for how to find rest. And I think a lot of it comes down to being really present and connecting to our bodies, which is something we've talked about too. With Ayce, can be sometimes difficult as a transgender person to learn that, but to really be present in our bodies in the moment. Because it's like I keep storing up for myself treasures, to use the quote, for this future, but then I arrive at that future and I'm not there to enjoy it because I'm then focused on the next thing, kind of like that
thing. Right.
Idea
it's the
my retirement at 65 and then we'll start living. You don't want to think that way. So any tips you have for how to actually be like, okay, because I think I talked about this too, maybe with Ayce, is just like I used to go for massages and I would spend the entire massage thinking about what I was going to do after the massage. That's terrible. I'm not actually relaxing. So
it's like, how much am I paying for this rumination?
Right.
Yeah, well, first I want to address the productivity. I think that's probably one of the biggest pieces. And that's also indoctrination into the Protestant work ethic of our country. Okay, it is so ingrained in us that we don't like the word lazy, and we feel our value, again, our value is outside of us. It's in how productive we are. How much did I get done? And it's so big. So here's a quick way I like to think of the Protestant work ethic, is that hard work equals morality. I am a good person when I work hard. And we virtue signal that like crazy. Which, oh, sorry, I didn't get back to you. I'm so busy. Virtues. And that's all virtue signaling. I just want you to know I'm a good person. I didn't get to you because I'm so busy. I'm just being productive. Okay. We need to learn to let that go. That is so hard for people because we cannot relax when we do that. It's like I say, it's almost like we all believe that we have to do a certain amount each day to earn our spot on the planet. Did I do enough today to deserve to be here? And it's such a terrible way to think. There's our worthiness again. And I'm always telling people we have inherent worth. You would be okay and deserve to be here even if you laid on the couch all day. Your value and worth is not based on what you produce. Let's move it inward. I say everyone's self-worth, they've put in the hands of other people. Our job, we need to move it in here to embody it. We think that if I get other people to see my worth, that somehow through osmosis, I will feel it and believe it. It doesn't work that way at all. Okay, so it's about going, wait a minute, why am I doing this? And who is it for? Well, it makes me feel so good when I get stuff done. Well, yeah, because now you think that you're a good enough person. Instead of, I lounged around till 10 and I didn't shower. And as long as that's not all the time, as long as you eventually get to stuff, if you're not showering all the time, that's a problem. There might be some depression there or something. But it's getting off that hedonic treadmill is a challenge. But when we can just be, like, I know I'm good. I'm proud of myself if I get one thing done a day. I love it. Like, look, I did that. That's awesome. Now I'm going to just relax. To have that comfort with yourself that I don't have to prove to anyone else. So really examine, but it's that treadmill of, if I sit still, all the thoughts are going to come and then the emotions will come. And I don't like that. So let's keep busy. As long as I'm busy, I'm outrunning my fears and my thoughts and my emotions. Because no matter what, very few of us know how to be with our emotions still as grown-ups. We're afraid of them. So, and we live in a culture that teaches if you're doing life right, you're happy. We're okay so we're striving to, if I just have this and I'll be happy, then I won't feel bad. Okay. But let's just learn to sit with disappointment. We can feel sad, doesn't mean there's something wrong with us necessarily. We can feel fear, doesn't mean we're in danger. Okay. It's about just slowing down, being with ourselves, so we don't have to keep going.
So you should be able to feel our emotions. I think when I started on my own kind of healing journey, I thought I would have this result of like, now I'm tough and resilient. And instead it's like, I feel so mushy and vulnerable because I'm feeling everything. I've taken down all of my walls, but I do think there's a part of that can tie back around to this idea of like not wanting to take up space. Like, I feel like I should never be financially dependent on anyone, emotionally dependent on anyone. And that's just my own way of not being a burden and staying quiet, staying out of the way. So that's all tied together. And I loved the way that you talked about it with that kind of Protestant work ethic. So I don't think it would be an episode of Holy Unapologetic unless we talked about some religious trauma. So I wanted to for these very well-meaning parents that have all been raised in religion, raising their children in religion, it's just seen as the most moral thing you could possibly do. Can you speak to it from almost like as clinically or maybe as emotionally as possible to reach kind of this parent that thinks that they're doing the best thing they possibly could by having their child go to church? What are some of those actual like traumas that we can experience from these upbringings that the parents that love their kids would want to realize that might be hard to when you think about it in purely a black and white morality stance?
Boy, this, such a touchy subject. Let's throw in some abortion here while we're
question.
at it.
Yeah,
let's,
right?
let's.
Yes or no?
Boy, I know, boy, this gets so touchy, but gosh, some of the harm, there's psychological harm to be sure, emotional harm, social and relational harm, spiritual harm, even physical and sexual harm. And that's not every church, every denomination, but I really do. If you look at it logically, religion is about control, power and control. That's it. And people don't like to hear that. Okay, so that's why it's hard to talk about, because people hold so dearly to this. And how do you keep those structures that don't make sense, where certain people have power, is then you create all these stories around it, to keep it. How is it, oh, well, to get to heaven, you have to do these certain things.
So for me, I feel like I was indoctrinated into Christianity, and I didn't have a differing worldview. And so I came at the world with a perspective that was biblically centered and based. And as I started traversing my life, it was really clear as I started interacting with other people who had different life stories that like the Bible didn't hold up to what I knew to be true in this world and my experience today. And so what I ended up feeling was religion was a sense of power and control over me to keep me repressed and in line with this story that they want me to live my life out in this sort of way. And so that's been a really interesting space to sit in and to get curious with, because my entire purpose for the first 38 years of my life was to get people to hear the story, the Christian story, and then to basically submit to that religion in such a way. And it was interesting because as I got more curious with my faith, it didn't hold up to my life experience. And I kind of wonder sometimes, like, if I would have been born in another country with another religion where, say, Mormonism or something like that was really big, maybe I would have been a Mormon. Maybe I would have been a Muslim. Maybe I would have been, XYZ, throw in your religion. But because of where I grew up, it was expected for me to not only believe this to be true, but to live my life in such a way that reflected that, yes, I'm sold out for this. And so it was really interesting when I came to you, actually. I was looking for a different perspective like I had been ingrained with all of this of I need to live my life in this sort of way and do these things so that I ended up in heaven and all of that. And being in a space and in a room with you, I could actually get curious with my life experience and then also what I believe to be true. And just kind of pull at the strings a little bit and say, does this really align with who I am and what my life experience is and how I want to live out my life? I don't know if you have anything else to add from that, but I'd be interested to hear you guys' perspectives.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to the power structure side of it. And you had mentioned before, Anya, too, the idea of like kind of the parents being in the control. And I remember seeing a documentary about the church cult that was like, yeah, so you have their parents, but then the dad's more important, but then you have the church and the leadership of the church, and then the pastor's more important, and then you have God and Jesus. And I just think that structure was kind of funny for me because my dad was the pastor and he also always had a big beard. He looked a lot like Jesus. So it's kind of, there's this alignment of all of these things in terms of like the power structure and the hierarchy. And it's like the biggest healing I had in my life, especially with my relationship with my father, was when I left religion and realized like, oh, he's just a human being. Like he doesn't have to be a deity. Like he's flawed. He loves us very much. He's a good man. There were a lot of things I wish were different about my childhood, but separating that out from the power hierarchy of like your parents always know the perfect thing and your church leadership always knows the perfect thing and you're just supposed to fall in line. And then just the more distance from it, I think it can be easier to see things that were more damaging about that upbringing, as we've talked about so many different things today. But I think it can be really hard to have those kinds of conversations with people who, like I was saying, associate it purely with the moral structure and think that, you're leaving religion because you want to go sin and that's all you want to do. It's like, oh, they're perfectly moral people. And it's almost kind of sad to think that you would inherently be amoral if you didn't have that book. Like you wouldn't be empathetic towards other people and want to care for mankind if you weren't in church every Sunday. It sounds kind of absurd now, but it is, I think, difficult to have different kind of, let's say, ideological debates with people when they assume that it is black and white and morality based as opposed to, all the gray as we're talking about. So it's
Right.
it's
Right.
so I think it's especially, for loving parents that think the best thing they can do is put their kids into church. It can be hard to say like, oh, that might be the source of a lot of damage. So I guess I
Yeah,
have sympathy for that.
it is. It's hard. I think we might be having a very different conversation if we all lived in Europe. Europe has been much more secular,
Mm.
much longer than we have, and our country just is like pulling more toward religion, it seems, Um, yeah, and those are very true. So, well, let me just kind of go over kind of things that cause religious trauma. Would you like to hear that?
Love
Yeah,
it.
great.
So, one is authoritarian environments. So, strict hierarchies, dogmatic teachings, and inflexible rules. Okay, a lot of rigidity. Spiritual abuse. So, exploitation, manipulation, or coercion by religious leaders and members. Exclusivity, belief systems that demonize outsiders or forbid questioning of doctrine. Okay, that causes trauma. Identity suppression. Here we go. Pressure to deny or suppress sexual orientation, gender identity, or other aspects of personality that conflict with religious teachings is another one. And then fear-based doctrines, the emphasis on punishment, hell, or divine wrath for perceived moral failings. Those are really the things that cause the trauma in us. And if you look at all that rigidity and no flexibility, again, this golden yardstick, I say that these measurements that we then look at, do I measure up? Am I good enough? Or am I a sinner? Am I a failure? And when we're talking about humanity, with all its variance, means that we're all going to feel that we're not good enough or try really hard to meet these benchmarks that aren't realistic. It's almost like keep striving, and that becomes the distraction so that you don't really recognize what's going on. That you're kind of being controlled and manipulated to keep, again, like capitalism, certain power structures in play. And it's so hard to come out of that. I remember, so I'll tell you, I grew up in California, moved to the Midwest in like 1992, and that's when someone said, everyone started asking, where do you go to church? And I told my husband, like, oh shit, we should probably go to church. We started going to, and I'll tell you, my grandfather was a Southern Baptist minister. So I grew up, I was christened Catholic, raised Southern Baptist, and then didn't go to church, never really bought into it, even as a kid. I loved my grandpa so much, but I asked my grandma, why is grandpa always yell up there? It was a fire and brimstone. He'd shake the Bible and you're a sinner, right? But I loved my grandpa so much. I didn't understand why he did that. And then my husband didn't go to church, but he said, well, one time we went to congregational church. So that's where we started going. And they were open and affirming. It was very liberal theology where God was God, God wasn't he. They did a lot of social justice, open and affirming to gay. That was even challenging in the church with some of the older people. So we started going to church. We go to this very liberal church, which was very different. And we read like historical Jesus books. And I was talking to this neighbor. So there's a Jesus historian, Marcus Borg, who wrote about probably the real Jesus was probably the product of a prostitute, not a divine, kind of thing. And I started telling someone this. I thought, well, if I'm going to be a Christian, I could buy into this, that this makes more sense to me, that this wasn't a divine birth, whatever you call it. I can't even think of the terms. And he said, I don't want to hear that. This guy said, I don't want to hear that at all. I go, why not? He says, because if there is no point in being a Christian if he is not divinely given by God. There's no point. I was just blown away. Like, why would you not want to just live in fact as opposed to a story? And that's where I learned too in this religion that in the UCC that the Bible is just stories. It was a storytelling time. They're parables. They are not fact. And you can take it, if you take it as story and everything has a lesson, that's much different than believing that that this actually happened. But even that can be so challenging to people. This thing of faith and belief, it's really touchy, but it can be so damaging.
I remember the moment when I think it was my mom's cousin who was talking to his own daughter and saying that, like, oh, well, Noah's Ark was just a story. It didn't actually happen. It was, and I was like, what? That's not what I was raised with. And so then like that started to be a big crack for me in the surface was like, oh, I don't think any two Christians believe exactly the same thing. Because that's a pretty big difference there. But yeah, I mean, it should be enough that there was a man that had incredible teachings, that was influential and taught people how to love each other better. That should be beautiful regardless of what the origination of, his genetics.
So if I can be so blasphemous, I like to think that I bet Jesus was on some psychedelics, which is when you get that kind of connection to the divine, why couldn't it be that? Jesus being a historical figure seems to be someone who actually existed, could have just been more connected to the universal. There doesn't have to be something really mystical about it. There are people who are more enlightened.
Yeah. And I just remember like bringing up, I think in college too, where I was like, oh, I'm reading some of the Tao Te Ching and writing some Confucius. And it almost felt like my parents were kind of like a little scandalized by that. And it's like, shouldn't we just want to learn as much as we can about everything? And then I start to think like, I wish instead of all those years in Sunday school studying the same couple stories twisted in different ways depending on what age I was reading the Tao and I was reading these other texts about, reading Marcus Aurelius or something, like there's all of this incredible human history and knowledge and wisdom passed forward. But there's this idea of like, no, if it's not from our book, then it's going to be bad somehow, which is incredibly limited thinking. But
Well, right, but why does that happen? Well, it's so you don't learn more, so you don't challenge the system
yeah,
as it is, to mess up the power structures.
yeah,
That's
yeah. The
the
only good I
insular nature.
else. And that was it was crazy too, because as I was watching these different documentaries about different churches and cults, they all kind of had, like, eventually you start to realize the pattern. And a big one was us versus them. And this is where you get your information. Everyone else is wrong. And we were, kind of raised with the same thing where it's like, we are not of this world. Like, this is, the world is sinful and bad. So you have to come back. But once you cut off everyone else, but your one source of information, then they can go all kinds of crazy in different ways. So it's like, even in the perfectly good church that exists, they are following very problematic patterns that can be used in abusive ways for those power structures.
Right, right. Yeah, for sure. Well, Ace, how has it been for you? Because most people don't venture into that territory, like that person I talked about. Don't challenge me. How has it been for you to have your world
Yeah,
rocked like that?
yeah. So I've intentionally put myself into those spaces where other people have different perceptions than me. And it's kind of wild, but the things that I've learned the most about, or the people that I've learned the most about, are from people that I was told not to have conversations with or to interact. And like, some of the best things that I've learned in my life have come from sex workers, people that are prostitutes on the street, and how they interact with people in this world today, and what does it mean to actually show love and compassion and care for a fellow human that's in the room with you. And so that's been something that's been so great for me, is that through my coming out journey and moving away from religion, I was able to open up my mind and critically think about, okay, what else is out there? Can I get curious with this? And can I use my own discernment to find out what's true for me and my life experience and how I want to go about walking through this world and interacting with other humans? Yeah, I wish, honestly, that religion didn't even exist. I think it's one of the greatest evils that are out there. But it's something that people can grab a hold of and find hope. They can find a purpose. They can find a hope for their future. They can find a hope for their afterlife. Instead of being present with the here and now and engaging in the world and learning how to flow in whatever the universe may be bringing your way, religion almost is an easy escape to say, this is what I believe to be true, and I'm going to hold to this, and this is what I'm going to believe for the future, versus actually doing the deep dive and saying, okay, this is what's going on right here, right now, as a human. This is what I'm feeling. This is what I'm experiencing. And so that's been a huge catalyst for my growth in just evolving as a human. Is I'm going to set aside the religion and the things that gave me a hope and a purpose, and I'm going to be present right here and engaging with the person that's across the table from me, and seeing them as a fellow human that's on a journey and that has an experience and a life story that I may or may not know, but let me listen to it and get an understanding of why they have the perceptions that they have and the viewpoints that they have, and then meet those people in that space. And so that's been a way for me to move away from religion and move into more my authentic self and how I engage in the world today. And you've been a huge part of that, Anya. So I just want to say thank you for giving me a different perspective to be able to say, what if this is true? What if this is true? Can we get curious with why you believe what you believe? And maybe we need to start pulling at those strings to see if that really is true for you. So just thank you for diving into these conversations with us today and with me in this life. You've been a huge catalyst for my growth in understanding humanity to a much deeper degree.
Well, I want to give kudos to you because what you're doing right now is very brave. I mean, both of you, for sure, and every trans person out there. But to speak just what you're talking about of the bravery it takes to get out of your own comfort zone and your own beliefs is huge. If more people could just do that and be open-minded instead of closed-minded, it would be a very different world. And it takes a lot of bravery to be challenged like that, because it creates discomfort inside, that challenge. But getting back to critical thinking, being able to hold more than one idea at once would be so great if we could start to cultivate that in our culture again. So keep it up and spread it, because when you do it and you hold space for someone like that, maybe they can do it for someone else too. I don't agree with you, but I can hold both of these thoughts, multiple thoughts. And that would make the world much better than you're either Democrat or Republican or Christian or atheist, or, put in your own extremes right there, and let's work on living in the middle.
Validating somebody else's experience. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I think that can be the troubling thing, is when you think we have all the answers, and that's definitely the way that I was raised, was either we have all the answers, you can ask someone that knows the book more and they'll have the answer. And all the greatest technological advancements and societal advancements are people saying, I don't have the answer, but I'm going to try to figure it out. And so, because there's so much that we don't know, and that can be in its own exciting thing. But I think what I come back to is, very similar to what you were saying, Ayce, is I think, therefore I am, in my version of it, is I feel things, so I assume other people feel things. So if there's nothing else I can know for sure, I'm going to try to take care of myself and treat other people well, and that kind of a thing, versus this is the black and white way that things are, and everyone else is wrong and a bad person. Back to empathy.
I feel, therefore we are.
Yeah. Let's take care of each other.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, I feel like we could go on and on, so I will definitely want to do that. So thank you so much for being here with us today. Is there anything any of you want to say in closing? I feel like this is a great point to kind of start to wrap up.
I just want to say thank you so much for allowing me to be here. It's been great, and I would always love to come back again. If ever the opportunity comes up, keep doing what you're doing, being yourself, trusting yourself, move your self-worth inside. Everyone, I'm working on it too. It's that humanity piece for all of us.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much. You have a wonderful rest of your day. And we'll see everyone on the next episode of Holy Unapologetic.
Take care.